And thank you so much to everyone for coming. As Rhodes Must Fall, we'd like to welcome you all to the Rhodes Must Fall in conversation with Achille Mbembe. This is our second session for the day. Earlier on today, from 11 o'clock, we had a very insightful reading group, which we normally have every Wednesday, but today it was led by Achille himself, and it was very interesting in the space working. And last week, part of our reading group, we looked at Concerning Violence by Frantz Fanon, and it was great having someone who has extensively written on the work of Frantz Fanon present with us. So I was asked to make clear that this is a Rhodes Must Fall event, and it falls part of our seminar series. It falls part of our seminar series that we've been having. Part of our work is not just occupying. We actually are also in the business of creating a curriculum or an understanding of education, African education, that we can run along with and want to make present. We are just not rejecting the type of education that we're being exposed to, but we are also building the type of curriculum we want to make available and we want to interact with on a daily basis. So I've been tasked with, the daunting task of this introduction. I hate these things because you never know what to say. You either get it right or very wrong. But also I will have a co-chair tonight, Lindu Swajan, who's going to be doing the question and answer session. I think I will get into, I hope I'm going to do this right, this introduction. But I will also open it up for Achille to introduce himself properly, because only he can do it right. So Achille Mbembe has worked extensively in the realm of African history working through a post-colonial lens, analyzing the political and social dynamic of the post-colony, as detailed in his book on the post-colony, published in 2001. Achille Mbembe and his work stand out as being key sites of interrogation in the context of the debate and efforts that Rhodes Must Fall Collective seek to contribute to. He's a leading scholar on the works of Frantz Fanon, and it is with great excitement that we prepare to engage with him on the present relevance of the notion of decolonization that borrow heavily from the insights of Fanon, as well as we attempt to contextualize its meaning for the tangible reality in which we presently exist. So I'm glad that that's all I'll be offering to everyone. But I will also be opening it up to him. So I would like everybody to please give him a warm hand.
I have to say that it's always a terrifying moment when you are waiting to be introduced. And you introduced me in the best way possible. It's the best introduction I have had for a long time. And I would like to thank you for this. We in Gauteng, in particular, have been following very carefully the events here and the work students and staff have been involved in. I also have to say that it's a work that is followed internationally. It is attracting a lot of interest from scholars, activists all over the world, people who only wish the best for South Africa and who only wish the best for its institutions of higher learning, of which this university is an important part of. So I'm very happy to be here. We had a fantastic session this morning, an open session. It was not in a classroom. It was in what seemed to be like a public space. People could come and go as they wished, pick up on one or the other idea we were trying to work with, and it happened in a very convivial spirit, and I'm very grateful that you associated me to that attempt at rereading Fanon for these times of ours. Now, when it comes to questions concerning the decolonization of the university and of knowledge in South Africa now, I think that there are a number of clear-cut issues many of us can easily agree upon. And if we don't, so be it, we can, of course, keep debating this. One such issue, I think, has just been dealt with, and successfully, at this very university. To those who are still in denial, it might be worth reiterating that Cecil Rhodes belongs to the race of men who were convinced, deeply convinced, that to be black is a liability. And during his time and life in Southern Africa, not simply in South Africa, but in Southern Africa, in the region, he used his considerable power, political and financial, to make black people all over the region pay a very bloody price for his beliefs. His statue, and those of countless others who shared the same conviction, has nothing to do on a public university campus 20 years after liberation. It simply doesn't. So the question is not whether or not the statue should be brought down. The question is, why is it that it has taken so much time for it to be brought down and be put in a museum, where indeed it belongs? That is the question. That it has been given a new life long after it should have been decommissioned is in itself an indictment against what this country pretends to stand for. So you are right to ask, you were right to ask for the statue to be brought down. To bring it down is far from erasing history. Rather, it is one of the many ways in which we can, today in South Africa, demythologize history and put it to rest, which is precisely the work memory, properly understood, is supposed to accomplish. The function of memory is to make sure that the ghosts of the past do not keep haunting the living. Is to put the ghosts of the past to rest, so that we can together chart new paths for a future we can share, a future that emerges from a divided past. So, some will ask then, what does bringing down the statue of a late 19th century privateer has to do with decolonizing a 21st century university? And they would be right to ask us to answer those questions. This is a legitimate question, which is being raised not necessarily by people who are against transformation. Last week, for those of you who still read newspapers, Ferial Hafaji, the editor of the increasingly influential City Press, raised the same question. she was wondering whether fighting over statues over the past has something, our addiction to the past, she called it, whether this has anything to do with our inability to build a future. A future which, in her eyes, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, is mostly about making lots of money. Is mostly about us all becoming consumers. So there is a serious question about the kind of future we want to build. It's absolutely important that the politics of futurity is back on the agenda after having disappeared for almost the last 20 years. And you are bringing it back on the agenda. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of future? Is it the kind of, to use a shorthand, neoliberal future in which we are all consumers before we are citizens, in which our new comrades are objects, we replace human beings with objects? Is it the kind of future we are called upon to build? And the response to Ferial is that, in fact, bringing down the statue of a 19th century privateer indeed has something to do with the decolonization of a 21st university. It does, because decolonizing the university starts with the deprivatization and rehabilitation of the public space. It starts with the rearrangement of spatial relations Fanon spoke so eloquently about in the first chapter of The Rest of the Earth. Colonialism is fundamentally about an unequal arrangement of spatial relations. And decolonization starts with addressing the question of spatial relations, insofar as they are the very structure from within which inequalities of all kinds, discrimination, segregation, secession from our fellow human beings, that is where it is incubated. So space is important, it is unavoidable, and we have to deprivatize it in face of the forces that are trying to fence it off, enclave it in the pursuit of privileges reserved to the few. And this is absolutely important, especially in a country that for many centuries has defined itself as not of Africa, but as an outpost of European imperialism in the Dark Continent, and in which more than 70% of the land is still firmly in the hands of 13% of the people. So, when we talk about decolonizing spatial relationships, this has nothing to do with going back to the past. It has something to do with transcending a divided history to open up a path for a future we can share equally. Then, the decolonization of buildings and of public spaces is inseparable from the democratization of access. When we say access, we are naturally thinking about a wide opening of the doors of higher learning to all South Africans. And for this to happen, South Africa must invest in its universities. It must, for the time being, it is spending 0.6% of its GDP on higher education. This is not acceptable. Neither Marx Price, nor Adam Habib, nor other vice-chancellors are responsible for this. So if we want to decolonize the university, as citizens of this country, we have to ask Pretoria, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Higher Education, to increase the percentage of the GDP of this country that is dedicated to higher learning institutions. When we open the Pandora box of decolonization, that's one path we have to follow up to the end. Now, when we say access, we are also talking about the creation of those conditions that will allow black staff and students to be able to say of the university, this is my home. I am not an outsider here. I do not have to beg or to apologize to be here. I belong here. When we reach that moment when black staff, black students can say, this is my home, then we'll know that we have made a lot of progress. As long as we haven't reached it, we have to keep pushing for this to happen, and it has to happen now. It cannot happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It has to happen now, 20 years after the end of apartheid. So such a right to belong, such a rightful sense of ownership, has nothing, of course, to do with charity. It has nothing to do with hospitality. It has nothing to do with the liberal notion of tolerance. It has nothing to do with me having to assimilate into a culture that is not mine as a precondition of my participating in the public life of the institution. It has nothing to do with that. It has all to do with ownership of a space that is a public common good. It has to do with an expansive sense of citizenship, itself indispensable for the project of democracy, which itself, this project of democracy, means nothing without a deep commitment to some idea of publicness. So what we have to recapture in the struggle to decolonize the university is that sense of common good, that sense of publicness, without which everything becomes privatized. That sense of the commons, if you want. There's no decolonization, neither of knowledge nor of the university, without a recapturing of the idea of the commons. In an age when everything is commodified, maybe with the exception of the air we breathe. That is the reason why it should not take 9 months to change the name of buildings. To change the iconography, the economy of symbols, whose function all along has been to induce and to normalize particular states of humiliation. We cannot accept that. We cannot accept that, and that's as simple as I stated. Staff or students shouldn't come into a university where there are images of people they know about. Because these people, whose images are present in these public rooms, are people, as I said earlier on, who really believed that to be black is a liability. Their images have to go. And you are right to ask that these images be brought down. And such images and symbols have nothing to do on the walls of a public university campus more than 20 years after apartheid. And here again, the question is, why did it take so long to bring them down and to put them where they appropriately belong? We are not asking for them to be destroyed. We are asking for them to be put in a museum where they will be properly contextualized. The museum as an institution in post-apartheid South Africa requiring itself a proper decolonization. Most museums in this country have not decolonized. So the struggle to decolonize the university is inseparable from the struggle to decolonize other cultural institutions, without which there is no sense of heritage, common heritage. Another side of decolonization is the university classroom. We cannot keep teaching the way we have always taught. It's no longer tenable. In an age that more than ever valorizes different forms of intelligence, the student-learner relationship has to change. We need to reinvent what I would call a classroom without walls, in which we are all co-learners. It's not easy to tell a professor, you know what, you spend this amount of time, studying, specializing, like that. Now you know what, you will be a co-learner with people who have not gone through the same kind of process. But that is what has to happen. And in its happening, we put the onus on the student to be responsible, to up the level of responsibility. We need to reinvent a university that is capable of convening various kinds of publics. Various kinds of publics in new forms of assemblies that become points of convergence of and platforms for the redistribution of different kinds of knowledges. That is the direction we have to go. And it has pedagogical implications, as well as, of course, political implications and aesthetic implications. Look at the architecture of our universities, the way they are built. They are built in the model of prisons. Go to UJ. It's a prison in the middle of a country that has so abundant energetical resources, beginning with the light. Those Africans who come from, that border, Limpopo, the first thing that strikes them when they land in Johannesburg is the quality of the light. Why is it that we build buildings that are in total contradiction with the abundance of light, the light we have, the sun that graces us, especially in Gauteng, most of the year? Why this kind of introverted form of architecture that in itself only speaks to the isolationist, the national chauvinistic parts of what this country is all about? So we have to extend the debate to those areas, because the way in which buildings are built can enliven render possible or prevent certain kinds of intellectual conversations. Now, there are many other practical issues I could add to the list of what needs to be decolonized. Systems of access and management, insofar as they have turned higher education into a marketable product, the mania of assessment, the system of business principles and statistical accountancy, which has resulted, as we all know, with an obsessive concern with the periodic and quantitative assessment of every facet of university functioning. Assessment itself becoming a professional specialty with its own typical procedures, its arcane language, and more importantly, its attendant mentality. We have to change this if we want to break the cycle that tends to turn students into customers and consumers, which is the case right now. So we need to change this. If the aim of higher education is to be, once again, to redistribute as equally as possible a capacity of a special type, the capacity to make disciplined inquiries into those things we need to know but do not know yet. That is the function of higher education. It's not to create jobs. That's not the function of higher education, is not to create jobs. As I hear when we debate on the state of arts and culture. So you have a government which believes that arts and culture is the same thing as agriculture. They ask you, okay, how many jobs are being created? We have to get out of that mentality. So, the function of higher education is not to create jobs. It is to redistribute as equally as possible the capacity to make disciplined inquiries into those things we need to know but do not know yet. The capacity to make systematic forays beyond our current knowledge horizons. That's it. That's it. That's the minimum agreement the minimum proposition we can agree upon when we deal with higher education. The rest, you complete the sentence. Now let me move to the most, for me at least, important part of this lecture. And while preparing it, it became clear to me that the questions we face are of a profoundly intellectual nature. They are also colossal. And if we do not foreground them intellectually in the first instance, if we do not develop a complex understanding of the nature of what we are actually facing, we will end up either with populist solutions that have nothing progressive, or with the same old techno-bureaucratic fixes that have led us in the first place to the current cul-de-sac. So those are the two things we have to avoid. We cannot indulge in populism, nor can we indulge in techno-bureaucratic fixes that have no context, no history, and that end up penalizing those who are the most in need of an upliftment. To be perfectly frank, I have to add that our task is rendered all the more complex because there is hardly any agreement as to the meaning, and even less so, the future of what goes by the name, the university, in our world today. Not only in South Africa. There's no agreement. There might have been some agreement at the beginning of the 20th century. That is no longer the case. So when we say decolonizing the university, what are we talking about? We all agree that there is something anachronistic with a number of higher institutions, institutions of higher learning in South Africa. And indeed, there is something profoundly anachronistic and wrong when, for instance, syllabi designed to meet the needs of colonialism and apartheid should continue well into the liberation era. It doesn't make sense. It simply does not make sense. To keep teaching our students anachronistic kinds of knowledge. We have to decommission those knowledges. Lots of knowledges and institutions have to be decommissioned. Just like, you have cars that are badly built. They are sold to clients only for the company to realize that in fact they have defaults. They are decommissioned in the sense that they are taken out of the market. And the same applies to a certain number of ideas and a certain number of institutions. The point is, when do we know that such and such an institution has to be decommissioned? And those are the kinds of questions we should be asking. They were not asked properly in 1994. That's why we are still dealing with things that should have been resolved long ago. So, we, or at least some of us, agree that part of what is wrong with our institutions of higher learning is that they are quote-unquote westernized. The question is, what does it mean they are westernized? And then we are told that they are westernized in the sense that they are local instantiations of a dominant academic model based on a Eurocentric epistemic canon. And part of this is true. But what is a Eurocentric canon? A Eurocentric canon is a canon that attributes truth only to the Western way of knowledge production, that relies exclusively on the Western archive to account for the multiplicity of the world. That is a Eurocentric canon. And it is not acceptable. A Eurocentric canon is a canon that disregards other epistemic traditions because they are other epistemic traditions, they are other archives. I could go on and on talking exclusively about something we can call the African archive, which is an archive that is planetary, just as the so-called Western canon, which is an archive that has been constituted out of the dispersion of people of African descent in the four corners of the earth. There's not one single corner of the earth that has not been, to some extent, shaped or co-shaped by African presence. Just take, for instance, the African American archive. And I'm only talking about the written archive, which dates from the middle to the end of the 18th century. And that archive is part of the Western archive. And that's the paradox. So, when we say Westernization or de-Westernization, we'd better know what we are talking about. When we say out or down, rather, abajo, down with Westernization, are we forgetting that, in fact, we are the co-makers of the Western archive? And if we are the co-makers of the Western archive, why don't we claim it? Why do we prevent ourselves from claiming what rightfully belongs to us? So we have to re-problematize properly what we mean by de-Westernization. This morning we are reading Frantz Fanon. The power of Fanon comes from his triple heritage, which he assumed entirely. Intellectually, it comes from him being part of, contributing decisively to the debates about psychiatry in the aftermath of the Second World War. In dialogue with philosophers such as Merleau-Ponty, such as Marx, such as Sartre, such as Hegel, such as Freud, and for that matter, Lacan. There's no way in which anybody can say anything meaningful about Fanon if one doesn't recontextualize him as, in fact, a French intellectual. Which doesn't necessarily mean that he was anti-black or whatever. He wasn't. But that's not it. He was able to transcend his Frenchness through his commitment, his tying his fate to the Algerian Revolution, and through his work, both medical and political, on behalf of the African people. So, in relation to just an ordinary French intellectual, he is richer because he is able to claim what is owed to him in this tradition and to add to that something else which the others don't have. That's how we have to see it. We do not have to see it in terms of secession. Secession as ours, or segregation, as I was arguing this morning with the students, it's a footnote in the Black Archive. It's a footnote. Read Marcus Garvey, read Delany, read them all. When they talk about Africa, it's never in terms of the continent being separated from the rest of the world. It's always in terms of embracing a planetary project. And in embracing it, create the conditions for each and everyone to share in what is common. So, once again, we have to come back to the question of the common. Even when we argue against the injustices of racism and discrimination, we cannot lose sight of the ultimate destination, which is the constitution of something common and shared not only by humans but also by other species. Second thing is that calls to decolonize are not new. I see that you haven't uploaded at that section. And it will be very interesting during the discussion to come to that. Because these are the issues you yourself are raising, and we have to be serious about them. They are not easy. They are very complicated. And we have to confront them. So I'm happy that you didn't upload, which means that there is some area there of serious discussion to have in a minute. Now, to come back to Fanon. Now, what I'm doing now is that I'm trying to tease out the different meanings of the term decolonization in Black Archive to show out its complexity. So when we use the term, we know exactly what we are talking about, and in the process we can articulate a better strategy of struggle. That's the purpose. The purpose is not to tell you, oh, it's too complicated, don't do anything. The purpose is for us to develop a critical intelligence so that we hit more powerfully and more decisively the structures of racism. We cannot hit the structures of racism with simplistic notions. The fight against racism forces us to be smarter. You do not defeat racism if you are not smarter than the structures of racism. So that's the purpose of tonight's discussion. It's not to say, oh, too complicated, go back and just agree with whatever is going on. Because part of what is going on is wrong and it has to change, and it has to change now. So let's try to render a bit more complex this thing. So calls are not new. And whenever they have been made, they have never gone uncontested. And such was the case in the 60s and 70s in Africa. And you know, but we have been saying this all along, South Africa has to take seriously the post-colonial experiments. South is not. And if it doesn't take seriously, it doesn't study properly what has happened in the rest of the continent, it will repeat mistakes it could have avoided. And for the time being, it's not doing that. So we have to take seriously our location in the continent. When we look at what has happened with the concept of decolonization in the continent, we notice two things. One, it was for a long time assimilated with another concept, that of africanization. The idea being that to decolonize is the same thing as to africanize. Now, when we read Fanon, Fanon is very critical of the project of africanization. His critique of africanization, you find it in chapter 3 of The Rest of the Earth. Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Pitfalls of National Consciousness is a text every young South African in a South African university should read. Whether you are studying engineering, medicine, or any other discipline. I'll tell you about Fanon because I think that he's relevant to the current debate, and then I'll move on to another author. Fanon is critical of Africanization because he believes that it's a project of the newly independent black middle class. So we have, I don't know, we are told that some of you belong to the middle class, I'm not sure. There's all these excitement about the new black middle class. The World Bank, financial institutions, they are all now into the discourse of the middle class. Seen, of course, as potential consumers, in 2030, we'll have more middle class people in Africa than in China. And when you translate that into trillions of dollars, it really makes sense. It's cool for investors. Absolutely cool. I have some friends who manage pension funds. I talk to them, they tell me, you know what, there's no better place than Africa to invest right now. It has been the case for the last 10 years, with growth rates shooting up everywhere except here, which should give us pause for thought. So, Fanon didn't buy into that. He was very suspicious of the middle class. He thought that the post-colonial middle class, and I quote him, was lazy. It was not only lazy, it was unscrupulous, it was parasitic, and above all, it lacked spiritual depth. Why? Because it had, I quote him, totally assimilated colonialist thought in its most corrupt form. So that's quite an indictment. He didn't believe in the black middle class. It was not engaged in production, nor in invention, nor in building, nor in labor, because its innermost vocation, Fanon thought, was not to transform the nation. It was merely, and I quote him, to keep in the running and be part of the racket. For instance, it constantly demanded the nationalization of the economy, and especially of the trading sectors. But nationalization quite simply meant, quote Fanon again, the transfer into native hands of those unfair advantages which were a legacy of the colonial past. I can go on and on Fanon's indictment of the African middle class and his critique of Africanization. But these are things you can read in that chapter 3 of So Africanization for him was the ideology masking what fundamentally was a predatory project. What today we call looting. If Fanon was with us today, he would probably use terms such as that. But where it becomes really interesting for our times is in the sense that Fanon took a certain discourse of Africanization to be akin to something he called retrogression. Retrogression when the nation is passed over for the race and the tribe is preferred to the state. And retrogression, when behind a so-called nationalist rhetoric lurks the hidden face of chauvinism, as evidenced during his time by attacks on fellow Africans in Côte d'Ivoire, in the Congo, all what we have been talking about here in 2008 and recently. So he was ill at ease with it because calls for Africanization were, if not always then, in most instances, haunted by the dark desire to get rid of the foreigner. We can go on and on this. So Fanon contrasted Africanization with decolonization, which we studied this morning. Decolonization having to do with the creation of new forms of life that could be characterized as fully human. The time of decolonization having, of course, a double character. The character of a time of closure, when you close that which is no longer necessary to open up the future. And the other character being that decolonization is a time of possibility. Can come back to that if you want. So that's one critique of Africanization as, let's say, decolonization as Africanization. How do we situate ourselves in relation to that debate is a question we should all be reflecting upon. Let me move to a different author whose name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And Ngugi wrote a book in the late 70s, early 80s, called Decolonizing the Mind. Just notice the difference. Fanonian is a theorist of decolonization as an event, a future-oriented event, an event that is supposed to open to that which is to come, and that which is to come is, and here he uses the biblical expression, is the time when those who were last will become the first, which is a concept you find in the book Les Béatitudes. I don't know how you call it in English, but it's called Les Béatitudes. You also find it in a major text in the Bible, which is called the Magnificat, which is an amazing revolutionary text. So he's borrowing here from the Judeo-Christian tradition in order to account for an event that is happening in a different context than April. So Ngugi talks about decolonizing. And for him, decolonizing is a search. A search for what? For what he calls a liberating perspective. What does he mean by this expression? He mainly means a perspective which can allow us to see ourselves clearly, first of all. This business of seeing ourselves clearly, of emerging out of a specific kind of blindness, where we have eyes, but we don't see ourselves clearly. We see ourselves in a fuzzy way. So the project is, first of all, to see ourselves clearly. Second, to see ourselves clearly in relationship to, and I'm quoting Ngugi, other selves in the universe. Not in South Africa, not in Cameroon or Senegal or in Africa, but in the universe. What you have here, just as you have it in, if you read properly our archive, is a conscious engagement with world history. That our struggles are not particular struggles. They are expressions of a struggle on behalf of the entire humanity. That is what the struggle against apartheid, that is what it meant. How come we move from there to killing fellow Africans on Pixley Summer Avenue in Durban, of all places? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. It's a struggle on behalf of the entire humanity. That's what Ngugi is saying. That's what Du Bois is saying. That's what Fanon is saying. That's what Senghor is saying. Glissant is saying. All of them, including Garvey. All of them. We therefore have to recapture for our times that embrace of the idea of humanity, on behalf of which our struggles make sense. That is what we have to do. And we have to hold our government in South Africa to that project. Because we will not decolonize the university if we do not do that. The decolonization of the university has to do with this planetary project. It's not a provincial project, it's a planetary one, and that's how it should be. So that's what Ngugi means by decolonizing. And I understand that he's coming here. Yes. And he should come here soon. Ngugi should come here soon. He will help this university of ours to see clearly. The problem is not to destroy UCT, the problem is to build a proper university for the 21st century in Africa. So Ngugi has to come here, and you should ask Max to invite Ngugi here. You should ask him. There's plenty of money around. I'm sure that money is not a problem. So, you see how it is that Ngugi, the length to which he goes in tying up the process of seeing ourselves clearly, which in his mind is the same as seeing for ourselves and seeing with others. We cannot see for ourselves if we do not see with others. So what we have to achieve is a capacity, an equal capacity to see together. And let me add that this has serious implications in terms of, for instance, how we reform the curriculum. It's not just, some vague, sentimental ideas. It has practical implications in terms of pedagogy, in terms of the reform of the curriculum. And as far as Ngugi is concerned, he is extremely interested in the question of language. Because you know what? Colonialism is monolingual. We cannot fight against colonialism if we adopt monolingualism. There is absolutely no reason why there are no departments of African languages in South African universities. There is no reason. I want to hear one reason why this is not the case. There is simply none. Colonialism is about monolingualism. We will not make it into the future if we stick with monolingualism. We have to break the stranglehold of monolingualism and open up a space for the circulation of multiple languages. That's part of the decolonizing agenda. I pass over Ngugi's consideration on what he called recentering. And I move to conclusion.